But we want to press ahead, and we are going to hear the lecture from Sheila Wise Rowe, and then I have a follow-up question for her as well.
Hello, hi, I am so excited to be here. My name is Sheila Wise Rowe. I am an author, I am a counselor, I'm a speaker. I specifically work with men, women, children around trauma, have been involved in ministry in the US as well as South Africa and in Paris, France. And so today I'm coming to share some of what is in my book, Healing Racial Trauma, The Road to Resilience, and drawing from some of my experience in counseling. And with that, I want to dive in. I'm grateful for the other panelists and what they bring to the conversation. It's really essential. As we think about racial trauma, it's important that we're thinking about what has gone before us and what is happening right now, that the two have a way of interplaying. One thing that struck me recently was in this year, it was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre. And I remember watching the Congress testimony of 107-year-old Viola Fletcher and how moving that was. And I remember her saying, just in vivid detail, what she experienced, what she endured. And she said that, you know, that she lived through that massacre, not just that day, but every day since. And that our country may forget, but that she doesn't forget. And that really struck me, that that is the reality for so many of people of color, Black folk. Like, we experience it daily, and we may not even be aware of that. One of the things that I really think about around trauma, and racial trauma specifically, is that how much it is very much linked to grief. And so I want to unpack that more and kind of look at racial trauma from a grief lens, because I believe in this particular season, with COVID and with everything that's happened last year and this year and even before, that we're carrying a boatload of grief and a boatload of trauma. I don't think it bears repeating, but I'm going to repeat it, that racism really is about power and dominance and control and asserting that dominance. Racism inflicts racial trauma, and at the same time it denies the pain that is caused. One of the scriptures that really highlights this for me is Jeremiah 6:14, where it says, "They've treated the wounds of my people carelessly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace." And this happens, and it has happened, and it continues to happen when we are not believed. That when a Black person comes and shares their stories, shares their trauma, they're not believed. We're not believed. There's a denial about systemic racism, that it exists. There's an attempt to gaslight us, to say, well, that's not really what that is. It's not, it shouldn't be a concern, or you need to get over it. A lot of the conversation right now about critical race theory is also that. It's a way of shutting down Black people and brown people. And yet the reality is that we feel that trauma every single day. Ironically, that sometimes we're seeing, although, you know, not from this kind of negative lens, but in a way that it is, and that we're seen as otherworldly. Like, you know, we're able to really withstand emotional and physical pain and trauma, and that somehow, you know, we have this super strength, but at the same time we are also accused of being lazy. Racial trauma is real. Every one of us deals with it on some level, whether we're aware of it or not. And even the ones that we see that are kind of propped up as the ones who are saying systemic racism doesn't exist, there's a level of racial trauma behind that. Some of us, as in that case, say peace, peace, when there is no peace. Some of us have had dysfunctional ways in which we've responded to trauma to try to cope. And for many of us, that was silence, because in our families, as we look at the enslavement of our ancestors, silence had to be paramount, because we could lose a loved one if we opened up our mouths. And so we've shut down, and we're fearful about looking inward. And there's a lot of stigma around that. Some of us, despite all of what has transpired, we have a faith and a hope that is really grounded in our experience, in we looking at scripture, although we were handed a Bible that was chopped up in pieces, and yet we saw in the story of the Israelites escaping from Egypt to freedom, our story, and it inspired us and gave us hope. And we saw in the story of Jesus as the one who was sinless and the one who could empathize with our weaknesses. And in that, we found hope. We found hope for freedom. We found hope to pursue justice. And we continue to hold on to that to this day. And yet, racial trauma rears its head almost regularly. And so what is racial trauma? Racial trauma is different from other forms of trauma. There's a notion in counseling about big T traumas and little t traumas. Big T traumas being ones where there's been like some major event, there's violence involved. Little t traumas are more troubling instances, and so we have these different kinds of engagements with trauma. For Black folk, we're experiencing big T traumas and little t traumas together. There have been studies that have shown that when you actually look at little t traumas, and if you have multiple little t traumas, you actually experience greater impact and greater trauma than a big, huge one-time event. And so if you think about that, and you think about the folk who've been pulled over by police officers, and they have said, and you can look at that and go, what's the big deal? You were pulled over by a police officer. In many of those instances, these people, men and women, were pulled over not 1, 2, 3, but hundreds of times. And so that does something to one. It does something to our ability to hope and to persevere. When we experience a racial trauma, what happens is that our bodies are ready for fight or flight. We're charged. Our hormones, our nervous system, body, everything is on high alert. And we feel like we've got to take immediate action against an actual threat. But if we don't deal with that stress, it stays in our bodies and it starts to affect us. And then another incident happened, and then we're in this perpetual loop where the stress just builds and builds. I want to say that, racial trauma is not just about something that's happening right now. It's not just about a recent incident, but it can go back in time. There's a study called Epigenetics, which looks at how our ancestors, what they endured, how that in some ways has weakened the DNA without changing the structure of it, but that then we're more susceptible to things like heart disease, and we're dealing with issues around emotional dysfunction, et cetera. We have symptoms that rear up. Our minds may forget, but our bodies don't. Some of racial trauma is transmitted through family lines, through stories. We hear about our ancestors and what they endured, and that affects us as well. We experience racial trauma vicariously also from watching videos, viral videos. We experience it real time. And the effect is that we start to show signs of racial trauma, and that includes low self-esteem, it includes anxiety, grief, anger, irritability, hypervigilance, depression. There's a preoccupation with anger and rage, and also ambivalence and unresolved guilt. And those are just a few things, and shame as well. There's a way in which racial trauma affects our bodies, and there's a term called weathering. And so weathering is when, because of this chronic stress that we're carrying, it starts to prematurely age us. And we start seeing these poor health outcomes. And a lot of what we're seeing with COVID right now and the disparities in the Black community particularly is because we've been carrying this racial trauma. Glenn Scaraldi writes about trauma, and he says that with trauma that we don't lose something, we also lose our way. That hard-earned gains and dreams for the future are irrevocably lost, or they seem that way. And development is seriously impaired, and that grieving is about finding our way again. And so when I think about racial trauma, I think about the importance of grieving, that is absolutely essential, that we engage in grieving as a part of the healing process. We have difficulty finding our way because the racial trauma is invalidated or has gone unprocessed or is ongoing. And then we're having these multiple losses. And now we're stopping long enough to start to look at all that is coming up, and particularly over this past year. And we're wondering, does God care? We're wondering, do other people care? Do white people care about our racial trauma and our grief? Over the past 20 months, we've seen so much that, these new hashtags have emerged, it seems like daily. And so now it really is about hashtag living while Black. And so we have got to figure out, like, how do we move forward in healing? And so I want to just take that grief model and really look at how do we deal with trauma. Our trauma is compounded, it's disenfranchised, it's complicated, it's anticipatory, and it's generalized. And compounded in that it's just pile on, disenfranchised in that we are often not given the space to really grieve. And that certainly is the case with the shutting down of the laws around CRT and all of that. It's like we're not allowed to grieve. It's complicated. In many ways, there are layers of it that we're dealing with, not just grief, but it's bitterness, it's anger. We're dealing with all of that. There's an anticipatory nature around it in that, before we even are able to grieve or to deal with what it is that we are feeling and what we're experiencing, that oftentimes, for many of us, we can shut ourselves down. And we can say that, no, you can't say that, you can't be that, you can't do that. Because out of fear of what might happen if we actually dream and if we actually hope, and that is dashed. And lastly is generalized, is that we have this generalized grief and trauma where it's not really, you can't really pin it on one thing, but it just seems to be really pervasive. And a lot of it's just the state of the world. It is the state of the church. It's about politics. And so we think about all of these ways in which we're dealing with grief, and we look at the grief model in terms of how do we work through that and apply it to racial trauma. If you think about those stages of grief, there's shock and denial, and there's depression and guilt, anger and bargaining, and then you start to see kind of an upward turn and reconstruction, meaning making, and acceptance and hope. Now, this is not a linear, like step 1, 2, 3, and we just make our way through that. Like we tend to circle in and out. It's like a figure 8. And so at some points we may be feeling anger, and then there's denial. If we think about how, with racial trauma and just given what we've experienced over generations, there certainly has been shock and denial. And some of us are still in that place where we are stunned by what happened, or we're denying what happened. If we consider the reactions around the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that it led to shock for many of us. But unfortunately, for some, it was denial. And for some, it was this belief that, somehow they deserved it. And that's so evil and disturbing. We go through this phase of depression and guilt. And so whether it's COVID related or it's around race, our feelings of sadness and grief are almost unbearable. And there is a way in which we carry guilt, feeling that somehow I should have or could have done something to have prevented it. I think about the teenager who filmed the murder of George Floyd, and she spoke about how at night she can't sleep, and that she apologizes and apologizes and apologizes to George Floyd because she could have done something. And you think, wow, she's 16 years old and she feels like she could have done something. And that's the kind of trauma that we carry. We deal with anger and bargaining, in which we just in our justifiable anger, it goes and leads to rage. It goes and leads to lashing out at God and others. in which we desperately want to change the situation. We want relief from our pain. And we've certainly seen that over this pandemic period, and just the anger and rage over injustice. The bottom line is that we all have had stories in our family line and even in our own lives. But to go deeper and to begin to heal, we need to move to the place where we begin to understand that time does not heal all wounds. It doesn't. Judith Herman talks about recovery and how recovery from trauma unfolds in several ways. And the first one is establishing safety. And the next is remembrance and mourning. And the third one is reconnection with ordinary life. So I look forward to unpacking more about Judith Herman's model around healing. And with that, I want to end and just to say that as we're healing from racial trauma, there's a quote from Susan Delaney, Dr. Susan Delaney, where she talks about how we grow around grief, that we actually become bigger, that in the end our feelings of loss become a small part of an enlarged mental and emotional space, and that grief may actually be a doorway to something new, like becoming an activist. And so I would say the same is true about trauma and racial trauma, to be specific. And with that, I want to end. But my hope is that as we begin to address in our pain and to begin to heal, and we begin to become activists, that all of this will help guard against pessimism and hopelessness, that nothing will ever change, and that we remember our faith, we remember Black love, Black joy, and Black hope. Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. Sheila, that was powerful. I want to do a quick follow-up question before I go into my presentation, and then we will have time after the musical interlude to expand this conversation. We spent so much time last year trying to make sense of all the protests. Masses of Black Americans, even joined by many concerned white Americans, protesting injustice. And I always thought that all those people in the streets, there's a lot more going on than just protesting a particular racial incident. And when you talked in your presentation about there is the infliction of racial harm, but then the denial of it, it sort of locks you into this vicious cycle where you're not crazy. You know when you are experiencing racism and when you are experiencing racial pain, and you want to give voice to it, and you're just met with denial. And I just felt that some of what was pouring out in the protests were symptoms of some of the trauma that we don't always have outlets to sort of process that, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you really have hit on something there, in that what we've seen is that, I think I'm frozen.
I hear you. You're good.
Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
You're good.
Sorry about that. I feel like you really have hit on something that, if you think about, I talked about how we, because of denial, we have really not been able to look inward, and to have people to gather around us, to pour out into the streets and to say, in a way, affirming the realities of, yes, this experience, the experience of Black people on the ground is real. And that in many ways, that was a first time for many of, I would say, more younger folk, but to actually see that level of outpouring was something that was new. There was an element of healing in that, and it was an element of hope in that. I struggle with it at the same time, because in some ways it felt like I don't know why everybody was there. There certainly were some who really wanted to say, I see you, I hear you, change has to happen. And then there are others who it was a performance. And to fast forward months later, 18 months later and more, that we're seeing a drop off in terms of these statistics that are looking at people's perceptions about systemic racism and the experience of Black lives, and to see such a dramatic drop off is that's sad to see that, and yet I try to hold on to the hope and that there were masses of people who were serious.
Yes.
They were there and
Yes.
they were saying, I see this, I want to do something about it, I want change. And so I really am looking for who are those people? Who are those people that we can align with and partner with and move forward? These are dangerous times, and we need all hands on deck. And so it's really about not just me, but I believe that our community, we've got to find those people within our communities and outside of our communities to come together and work to really make systemic change.
Thank you so much.